Good morning, everybody. My name is Paul Bramadette. I'm the director of the Center for Studies in Religion and Society here at the University of Victoria. And I'm very pleased to welcome you to the final installment of our Values for a New World series. Each of the 5 people we've invited to participate in this series has something distinctive to say about the world in which we now find ourselves. How did we get here? Who is struggling the most? What visions of the world are now revealed as especially problematic? And what political, spiritual, cultural resources can we turn to get through? Our other speakers have included novelist Essia Dujian, theologian Miroslav Volf, political commentator Noam Chomsky, and political scientist Thomas Homer Dixon. All of them will return with today's speaker to have a conversation about the key themes in the series on March 16th. For those of you who are new to the series, you're very welcome to visit the center's website where you can hear and see all of the other lectures that together constitute the series. Now, as we pause to imagine a better future, or with Chomsky's reflections in mind, any future at all, it's vital to note that we are not alone on this land or in this rebuilding process. As such, I want to acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory the university stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Now I'm very pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Linda Woodhead. Linda is Distinguished Professor of Sociology of Religion at Lancaster University and a member of the Order of the British Empire. She joins us today from Glasgow. She has led a number of projects that were of great value to scholars as well as educated lay people. These include a major project on the Muslim veil in Europe, a massive project on religion and society, and the very well-regarded Westminster faith debates, which included people such as Tony Blair, Richard Dawkins, Elizabeth Shackman Hurd, and Rowan Williams, the Archbishop of Canterbury. I've always found that Linda has a lot to teach us about the emergent forms of spirituality in our society, the role of women in broader secularization trends, and also the links between major social changes and the changes that are occurring in established religious communities. Now, I'm not going to provide you with a list of all of her publications because it's a long list, but I will say that she's a giant in the fields of religious studies and sociology, much appreciated for her playful, wise curiosity. She's probably best known for The Spiritual Revolution, written with Paul Heelas, A Sociology of Religious Emotions, written with Ole Rice. That Was the Church That Was, How the Church of England Lost the English People, written with Andrew Brown, and Christianity, A Very Short Introduction. Recently, we learned that she has been invited to deliver the prestigious Cadbury Lectures at the University of Birmingham in May of this year, an honor she shares with another one of our speakers in our series, Miroslav Volf. Today, we're fortunate to be joined by 3 people who will engage Linda in conversation right after the lecture. With us today are Geraldine Marcier, an anthropologist of religion from the University of Montreal, Nathan LaRudd, the Dean of Trinity Episcopal Cathedral in Portland, Oregon, and Marilyn Taylor, who leads the values-based leadership program at Royal Roads University here on the island. Now, I want to note that in this particular Zoom format, you are welcome to pose questions in the Q&A section of your screen, and then, time permitting, I'll convey those questions to Linda later on in our conversation. Now, before I turn the podium over to Linda, I want to welcome the new Bishop of the Diocese of Islands and Inlets, Anna Greenwood Lee, to bring the greetings of the diocese.
Thank you. Greetings indeed from the Diocese of the Islands and the Inlets. It's our honor and privilege to be part of this collaboration with the Center for Studies in Religion and Society and to play a part in bringing this series to you. This is my first time as Bishop of the Diocese to acknowledge the late John Albert Hall, who established a trust upon his death to further the exploration of the ideas at the intersection of faith and intellect. I also wish to acknowledge the tireless work of the small group of people who form the John Albert Hall Lectures Committee, who have pivoted very quickly in the last year to transform this series to an online format, which has been inordinately successful and has engaged participants from all over the world. As new bishop of this diocese, I've been exploring with curiosity the multifaceted diocesan vision that was developed in 2014 here. Like many businesses and institutions, the diocese formed its vision to highlight its core values and principles, and it's been a benchmark for how we've chosen to invest our resources over the past years. However, as the shape of the world has rapidly changed in the last year, I'm watching the communities identify new values and take on endeavors never previously considered. And so it is with a great amount of openness and frankly curiosity that I welcome Professor Woodhead today, and I'm eager to hear what she can teach all of us about value statements in these new times. Professor Woodhead, I'm very pleased to pass the screen over to you.
Thank you so much for those lovely, warm, kind introductions. Thank you so much for those lovely introductions. It's an absolute pleasure to be here. I wish I was in BC myself, but it's still lovely to be with everybody here. I'm going to share my screen, and I hope that you will be able to see this. Is that okay? Great. So my topic is something very topical, and I think it's something that the pandemic certainly doesn't create. But I think one thing the pandemic does is reveal some of the underlying reality of our social situation and our culture. And I think that's true of this topic of values, which fascinate me. I don't know how I really first got interested in this, but I seem to have always been interested in it. I have a strange background in that I originally studied theology and religious studies and philosophical ethics, and I taught Christian ethics in my first job. But I became more and more interested in what you might call operative ethics. I mean, how people actually live ethical lives in practice. And so I moved much more into social science, and I do a lot of survey research and participant observation and so on. And that lies behind what I'm going to be talking about today. But this interest really precedes values becoming such a visible part of our lives. And what I want to suggest tonight is that they've really taken over quite a bit of the functions of religion, not everywhere in the world. I'm only talking about historically Christian countries with a Christian heritage that are liberal democracies. So that cluster of countries, and of course that includes Canada as well as the UK, which is where I'm drawing most of my material from. I've tried to pick a few things from Canada, but I'm really looking forward to hearing from you how different things are in Canada and indeed other parts of the world that others of you may be from. So here's a little menu. I've got a very simple structure. I'm just going to show you this menu so that you know where you might want to go and make a cup of tea. I've got three parts. I'm going to just talk about this new visibility of values and illustrate that briefly. Reflect on why it is that values in the 21st century, why they're suddenly everywhere, so visible. And then I want to drill down a bit more and look at three contemporary value tensions, value clashes, or value wars. What's been studied a lot already, and that's the culture war, which is particularly associated with the USA, of course. Then I want to look at how I think we're living through a shift from Christian to post-Christian values, and how that causes some tensions between the different ethical systems we inhabit. And it's very evident in the pandemic around whether we really value care or not. And then I want to say a little about corporate values and how our personal values can clash with corporate values. And as I say, I'll try and illustrate how the pandemic has brought a few of these issues to the surface. So the rise of values, or what I call the new values visibility. It's everywhere. I mean, it's in every corporate statement you can see. This I just pulled off the web is Microsoft's corporate values. Very prominent. If you look at the top tabs, value is right up there and what matters to the company. And here are the three Microsoft values: respect, integrity, and accountability. This one just made me laugh when I saw it. Using values to improve your swimming lessons, just to show that values are in every activity of life now. Although when I actually looked at the document, it wasn't bad at all. I must admit, I learned something, and I think that if I'd been a swimming teacher, it might actually have helped improve my life a little bit and understand what I'm trying to do. It's schools, I think, where I first really noticed this values visibility. You can take these sorts of images from every single state school in Britain. Every school has to publish on its website its values and ethos. But it's not just tokenistic. I've been doing some research in primary schools, elementary schools, and talking to teachers in secondary schools as well. And of course, there is some cynicism about it, but there's no doubt whatsoever that the values regime is taken very seriously in schools. And where you have, for example, in a school like this, where I've just picked one, but it's very common to have 5 or 6 values like this. And you will find them on the classroom walls. You'll find them on a banner when you go into the entrance to that school. Some teachers, one was telling me the other day, they have in their school, she has a bag with tokens which have the value written on them. And when a child exemplifies that, then they're given the token. Or they've moved to a new regime where a friend has to say that person is exemplifying that. And they're woven through the lessons and the curriculum increasingly as well. So in that sense, they are taken very seriously. I have a PhD student, Charlotte Hobson, who's been scraping the websites of all the schools and getting a huge sample. And she's found that the #1 value in schools in England is respect. Every school almost has respect. It's the most commonly cited of all the values. We have symbols for values as well. One that's become really common in Britain, and I know in other countries too, is the diversity flag that originates in the counterculture of, I think, San Francisco and the struggle for gay rights, and particularly around the AIDS crisis time. But here it is flying outside a school in Kilmarnock, Western Scotland, and it's, you know, in a sense, it's a symbol of values, and it replaces or goes alongside your national flag or your old-fashioned school motto and crest. Yeah, I couldn't find one of a school in Canada, but this is Vancouver. Well, why? You know, why this new values visibility? And why so recently? Where did it start and where's it going? Let me just run through some of the factors. And first I want to start with political factors. These, I think, get a disproportionate amount of attention, often because people are quite critical of them. In the UK, Gordon Brown, the Prime Minister, and then David Cameron introduced the idea of fundamental British values. And there are 5 fundamental British values. And they are now, it's mandatory in schools to teach British values, not just to teach them, to promote them. There's a lot of cynicism about this, partly because people object to calling them British when they are citizen values, you might say. Partly because they are tied up with a backlash against multiculturalism and the idea of separate multicultural community developments. And of course, most prominently, they're tied up with a worry about Islamic radicalization, particularly in schools. And there was one incident in Birmingham that particularly led to them being put so centrally into the school curriculum, and they're inspected in schools as well to make sure that schools are upholding and teaching these, promoting and teaching these things. So that's a very political agenda about values. For a longer time, really, the whole human rights world has also been operating in this space and in schools. UNICEF in the UK runs a program called Rights Respecting Schools, and schools can sign up to this, and you go through different levels, bronze, silver, gold, and you get awarded. And when you do this course, you are taught about the I think there are 42 rights of the child, and teachers and pupils, and they're meant to run right through the school. So you have NGOs acting in this space as well. I want to move on next to the, I mean, there may be interesting other political factors in your countries to talk about, but let me move on to another reason for the values visibility, and that is more cultural factors. Much more neglected than the political factors, but I think really deeper and more important. One is simply the decline of Christianity. It's when you think about historically Christian countries and the church's role, the ethical, the moral role of Christianity was absolutely decisive. In a way, the churches had a monopoly on ethical teaching, and for quite a long period, socialization of public socialization of children as well through their control of the schooling system, and then through Sunday schools and such. So the decline of Christianity recently has been a very important factor, I think, in why values have taken over, and in some ways taken over the roles that, many ways, taken over the roles that churches used to perform. So I, along with some other scholars in the USA, have been looking at the rise of no religion. It's so high now in Britain that when people answer a survey asking what's your religion, a majority say no religion. And I mean over 50% in Britain. So it's in Britain, it's happened over a really quite long period. In the USA and Canada, it's happened more recently, but it's happening quicker. So you may get up to the same level of no religion fairly quickly. And so it's always very important in cultural terms when you get a new norm. So it's no longer normal to be Christian. It's normal to say that you have no religion. It doesn't incidentally necessarily mean at all that you are an atheist or you're anti-religious. It just means you don't identify with the label of religion or Christian or Muslim or Buddhist or whatever it might be. But that's an important part, I think, of what we're seeing here and why the rise of values. And this means that we've moved from morality to values. No one talks about morality now. It seems very sort of disciplinarian, authoritarian, moralistic. People don't talk about morals and morality in the way they used to. Do they talk about ethics? Yes. And principles? Yes. But values, that language of values, is the preferred one. Why? I think partly because it sounds more provisional, more diverse, and values, of course, are something that are relational. Something has value. We take the word from the economic realm. Something like a coin has money because it's valuable to someone. And we take that notion up when we use the word values. And so it seems less sort of absolute, and I'm telling you what's right and wrong. These are my values. You can say these are my values, and that implies that someone else will have different values. And that sort of accords with our love of diversity and respect and tolerance. And I think another reason is, values they're very communicable. I'll come back to this point. You can have your 5 values. You have a set of values. There are lots of websites that have 100 values and exercises whereby you pick your kit. It kind of fits with a digital world in which we're always doing quizzes and finding 5 simple characteristics, and they're very communicable. Now, along with the decline of the church and Christian influence comes a change in how children are socialized. So it's no longer so common that the parents simply transmit values or religion or both to the children. There's a lovely book on studying this in the USA by Chris Dell Manning, and she raises, it's a subtitle, this great question: how are unaffiliated, non-religious parents raising their children? And she says that what's common to them, even though they have very, very different ways of doing this, is they believe in the imperative of personal worldview choice. You know, it's a new norm. This is the one value that all the non-religious parents she talks to share. They have all sorts of different views about how they should bring up their children and in what values, or just leave it to the children. But they share the view that it has to be left to the child to make their own choices. That's a very different approach to socialization. And I think you can see why that is conducive to values talk and values thinking and picking your own. Okay, enough about cultural factors. Just briefly, there are wider socioeconomic factors at play here as well. And one is very obvious but often missed, and this is that we have moved from much more hierarchical to somewhat more, not completely, democratic societies relatively recently. I mean, since the start of the 20th century in Britain, and it's a slow progress. Now, in a hierarchical society, given roles carry their own rules and obligations. You know, if I'm a mother, if I'm a child, we know how children behave. There are lots of little sayings, you know, little girls should be seen and not heard. Even when I was young, all those things were really common. And they spell out what your role is given who you are. So you don't have to be all that reflective about it. And you don't have to choose as much. If you're a nobleman, noblesse oblige, you have certain obligations. This hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, I used to sing when I was at primary school, and it has a perfect example of this, you know, status roles: rich man in his castle, poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. Well, I think this is always probably idealistic propaganda, even in 1848, but it's interesting that it is a hymn. And an obvious point, really, you know, values are useful things. They're very useful as signposting us. They're useful as labels for what kind of an organization this is, what kind of a person I am. They're useful as a compass. They're how we prioritize. They can guide us. You know, in the wild west of the internet, for example, when you're encountering different groups and ideas, it's a way that you can sift a bit. Do you feel comfortable with the values that are being expressed in this chat, for example? They're useful to signal who I am. Now we all have to have a unique identity, and who else I should belong with, where I feel some kinship. And for organizations and groups, as always, as morality was, values are equally useful for regulating people, for disciplining, for socializing. This is partly why they're so prevalent in schools and so visible. They are very useful, politicians think, for social cohesion and conformity. And that's partly why something like the fundamental British values agenda. Every society needs to cohere through something, and values are the way we're trying to do it, or some people are trying to engineer it these days. And don't forget, values confer status. You know, literature will tell you that. The hypocrite, the moralist, the moral superiority, the person who stands on their moral pedestal. And we're just as good at doing that and condemning other people these days as we ever were in the past. And values will serve very well, thank you for doing that. You don't just need morality. Is there something two-edged about values? I'm sure you're all thinking this. I've been suggesting, in a way, they're a shortcut to an ethical life. They can be very sloganistic. And the way they are just expressed in these bare words means that they're just like a fundamentalism. They're like the way that at the beginning of the 20th century, some religions, first Christianity, in some of its wings, reduced itself to a few simple propositions. Now, that was no coincidence that fundamentalism arises at the same time as advertising. Simple, communicable, clear message. And the same is true of values. So they can have, even though we think they're wonderfully tolerant and relative, they can have a very fundamentalist aspect to them as well. I have actually heard the way some teachers talk about them in schools and thought they were from a religious school, when in fact it was a values-based school, because of the way they were talking about these as absolutes that are never ever questioned. And of course, in real life, the ethical life, which is life every day, you can never avoid ethical choices in the course of every day. In real life, being ethical involves much more than a set of values. It involves powerful stories that compel us, whether that's literature or film or whatever it might be. Symbols that we communicate with, cultivating sensibilities, trying, exercises to become more moral, and just habitual action, just exercising your ethical muscle, not just a set of slogans. Okay, so I have run through a little bit, just trying to illustrate this visibility of values, and then give you a range of things to think about why it should be that they've suddenly come to such prominence in societies like Britain, the USA, Canada. Now let me look at some areas where they come into conflict. Change, creativity, good things come out of tension and conflict. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Life is about conflicts and the negotiation of conflicts. So I introduce this without any particular negativity attached to, necessary negativity attached to these tensions and conflicts and wars. Now, I wanted to start by saying the reason I think that we're having these values conflicts, and there's probably nothing new about them except they were framed very differently in past, is that I don't want, when I talk about something like shifting, and I'm going to say how content shifts from a Christian to a post-Christian value system, I don't want to suggest some sort of evolutionary progress where you move from one stage to another and the previous stage is just discarded. Values don't die. Ideas don't die. Culture doesn't die. We layer up culture. We live in incredibly rich cultures where we can pick from the past and where it all gets sedimented together. You get strata, and you get strata of ethics and values. So Christianity might be in abeyance, but the Christian ethic doesn't disappear, and it still pops up in all sorts of unexpected ways, for example. But this is also why we get conflicts, because not everyone is singing, not everyone's moved from one stage to another. And some people are drawing on past resources, which are still very valuable, and they're finding that they hit up against the values of other groups and sectors of society. So it's no surprise that we would see, if values become visible, we're going to get more visible values conflicts too. Now, this is actually just to illustrate this point, that we've recently had in Birmingham again, a dispute about the compulsory teaching of relationship and sex education in schools, which was made compulsory in 2020. And it included teaching about homosexuality. And there were some protests outside schools. And the slogan is very interesting in this protest: let kids be kids. That's about, go back to the hierarchical society. Different people have different roles. So kids are kids, they're not adults. You shouldn't teach them about sex, they're too young. And notice the other slogan, my child, my choice. So this is also about the role of the parent and the rights that go with the role of the parent. So I've said we've moved from a hierarchical to a democratic society, but there are still many of us who retain elements of the old hierarchical part, and some groups who do that very strongly and want to protest about the shift to a new set of values in which you choose your sexuality. The child does. It's not new. You might remember in Britain there was Mary Whitehouse, always campaigning against video nasties and bad language on television. Protect children from obscene and violent videos. And there was a temperance movement before that, which was a very moral, it was a moral movement, not just about alcohol. And of course it provoked a reaction, the opposite. We want beer. I'm not sure if we want beer is a value statement or not, but you can decide about that. So let me start off with my first example, and this is the one that we will all be most familiar with because it has been the most written about and the most analysed for a pretty long time. James Davison Hunter wrote this book, Culture Wars, in 1991, I think it was. And the subtitle is important, The Struggle to Define America, but actually he's talking about the USA. And I'm going to argue that culture war is a distinctively USA phenomenon. People try and export it and get it going elsewhere, but it doesn't work in quite the same way for a reason I'll explain. It's still a brilliant book, and it was picked up and it became part of the culture war. Pat Robertson picked this up at the Republican convention in 1992, and it went into the political mainstream in the USA. What's interesting about the culture war is how almost anything in the United States can be pulled into it now. So the anti-vax movement can be pulled into the culture war. I just was looking at this paper that analyzes some US surveys to show that what the authors call Christian nationalism, which is a mixture of these three things I've written: white evangelical Protestantism, political conservatism, and anti-science attitudes. That's the best predictor of an anti-vaccine attitude. So you're seeing one side of the culture war getting identified with that anti-vax cause. Well, what is the culture war? What's interesting is it to just illustrate that point, it changes shape, it morphs a bit, except in one particular, and that's the gender aspect. The struggle over gender roles seems to be a constant. If you look on what some people call the manosphere on the internet and things like 4chan and the alt-right sites, it's just as prominent now amongst young people on the alt-right as it was back when Hunter was writing and before. So the role of women, the hierarchy of father, mother, child, homosexuality, abortion, all those cluster of issues have been and always seem to be central to the culture war. But other things change. When Hunter wrote, he talked about funding for the arts, and remember there was a lot of controversy about sacrilegious art. That seems to have just disappeared, really, that as an issue in the culture wars. Maybe I've missed something, but I haven't noticed that. The curriculum, that's still part of it, but it's got a new phase in the decolonizing controversies. Multiculturalism politically, yes, still somewhat. And then the public and legal place of religion. These are the things that Hunter identified in 1991. And he sort of pulled it all together and suggested that there are two sides in the culture war. And one side, the conservative side, or traditionalists, believes in, and this is a quote from his book, an external, definable, transcendent authority. So there's real objective truth out there, and we have to respect it. Whereas the other side, the liberal side, as you'd say in the USA, has the spirit of the modern age, a spirit of rationalism and subjectivism. That's really interesting that he puts it like that, and he gives it, he looks at not just at the values, but the kind of epistemological basis of it. Now, there's been an enormous amount of criticism of Hunter's thesis and a lot of counter-evidence, very powerful counter-evidence. This is one of the best books that really took it apart by going around the USA and doing hundreds and hundreds of interviews with people. And what Wolf has found, like many other people who've looked at the empirical evidence, is that when you ask Americans, they're mostly somewhere in the middle. The extremes are really very small in percentage terms. And most people, Wolf says, the culture war goes through American souls rather than dividing them when you talk to them individually. Davison counters, yes, it does when you talk to individuals, but I'm talking about the culture. I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about the media. I'm talking about the way that our public life gets shaped. I think they're probably both right about that, actually. And in a way, Hunter's been proved right by Trump era. One final point about the culture wars. Some scholars have pointed out or suggested that one of the things that has driven them is the moral self-righteousness, the value self-righteousness of secular liberal progressives, enraging by symbolically violating and condescending and preaching to those who don't agree with them. Jonathan Haidt, using psychology, suggested this. He said that liberals have some different value. Well, liberals have a few values. Conservatives have more, and conservatives can understand that liberals have values, they're just different. But liberals can't even see conservatives' values as values. They just think they're benighted and xenophobic, and moral insults are constantly made from the left to the right that provokes the culture war. And this has also been argued in a book that I like a lot, which is about online culture wars by Angela Nagle, Kill All Normies. And she says the same thing. It was the call-out culture, the cancel culture, the moral self-righteousness of the values brigade on the left, she thinks provoked the alt-right into being transgressive for the sake of it. And she's very good on transgression as a value and how the alt-right takes transgression and blowing up self-righteousness as what they're all about. So a little summary about the culture wars. I think gender, remains at the heart of it, but the polarization just gets momentum of its own and anything can be sucked in. That's why it's so dangerous. You get the bipartisan structuring of everything, including the media and of course politics, and everything like vaccines get sucked into that and oversimplifies everything. And everyone sort of knows it, but you can't get out of that framework. Here's my point I said I'd make. I think that why this is so distinctive to the USA is that it's the USA that gives birth to religious fundamentalism, to Christian fundamentalism at the start of the 20th century. And I think that's absolutely part of why this war, because both sides buy in to this wrong-headed idea that traditionalists have timeless truths that they can never alter, and progressives, as Hunter said, they can change and they're flexible and progressive. Life's more complicated than that, but that fundamentalist view and that religion is on that side and the secular on the other side is part of, I think, why it's such a USA thing, exported somewhere else. Okay, secondly, my second cultural tension is between the Christian ethic, a Christian ethic of life given, life sacrificed, and a post-Christian ethic, which I think we're increasingly moving to, of live your life, make the most of your life. And I want to look at how this has been exposed in the care crisis that COVID unfortunately revealed. Care home death toll national scandal, that's been a terrible scandal in Britain. I found some headlines in Canada early on, but I was just chatting beforehand about how important it was in Canada, and it does seem that has been a scandal in Canada too, the sheer amount of deaths in care homes. But the scandal is how no one thought about them, how they were just sort of left and neglected. It says something about how we value care. Now, I think we have moved, as I've suggested, from a Christian ethic. Now, the Christian ethic, there's no such thing as a Christian ethic. But in the 20th century, a particular version of the Christian ethic was very prevalent. And it was about agape, love of self-sacrifice. What was good was to lay down your life for a higher good. And you have concepts like service and charity that were pervasive. Now, charity, you'll notice, is used less and less. It's become quite a difficult word for people. Service, we don't notice, but it used to be everywhere. You know, civil service, armed services. It was just ubiquitous. And now you hardly ever hear it again. It's one of those words that's on the way out. It's stuck in things like the civil service, but we don't think of that anymore. These are asymmetric values. The relationships are asymmetric between the giver and the recipient. And if you look at something like the Queen of Canada, I know it is the Queen of Canada. If you look at the Queen's 21st birthday speech, I think it was in Cape Town, look at what she says. Not only the imperial background, but her dedication, it's very simple. I declare before you that my whole life shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family. And she has lived those values. She's an absolute exemplification of duty and service. And of course, she's devoutly Christian. And the Second World War was the 20th century is the era of the Great Wars. And it was natural that the cross was used to explain their significance. The hymn talks about lesser Calvaries. Each death was a lesser Calvary, a reflection of Jesus' death at Calvary. Now, we have moved from that. Those words have become uncomfortable for us because we don't think it's good to sacrifice ourselves anymore, except in the most extreme, unavoidable circumstances. Rather, we think it's good to live your life. I call it a live your life ethic. And each word matters. You know, live, go for it. It's got to be your distinctive life. It's yours, no one else's. And you've got to find out what your life is and live it. And life is a good as well. Life as a whole, not just human life, all life, and life needs to be respected. It's not just individualistic, that's a caricature, or not just narcissistic. I've got to live my life, but the ethic recognizes that you've got to live your life. In a sense, really deep individualism implies that respect for the other and supporting and helping other people to live their life. The good life embraces both those things. So it's being who you are and doing what only you can do, but it's also respecting and supporting others to do the same, especially if they're on a similar path as you. And it's not just about a liberal choice. It's also about discovering who you really are, what your sexuality is, you know, your ethnicity, all the rest of it, discovering and your talents and your aptitudes and your vulnerabilities, very much so. Now, I'm not the first person to notice this. Various people, including one of your many great Canadian thinkers, Charles Taylor, have talked about the expressive ethic or the ethic of authenticity. And Charles Taylor said a lot of very perceptive things about it. Where I think he goes wrong is in where it comes from. He sees it all in terms of great white males, really, and the artistic hero. And he doesn't notice that it was a struggle, a political hard-won struggle on the part of many marginalized groups to have their identities and their lives and their difference respected. And it still is. And it was often a battle against existing privilege. Rihanna is my go-to girl on this. It's where I get the live your life from. And these lyrics, they're much, much longer. The whole song is a perfect expression of these values. And you can read that for yourself. But it's about living her life, but it's also living your life. Those are both the essential elements of it and really living them. I don't want to be accused of being too excessively keen on the monarchy, but they are really good to think with, and they are very good symbols of values. And of course, the rift we've got at the moment between the royal family and Meghan and Harry is an absolute exemplification. On the one side, the old ethic value of service and sacrifice. And on the other side, the live your life in your own way. I believe they lived in Victoria for a while. Is that right, Paul? Did you tell me that? There you are. When they fled. If you want to track this shift of values from the Christian to the live your life, you can do it through lots of issues. And one of the really interesting ones is smacking a child, which, as this book, Spare the Child, shows, was a religious value and imperative in Protestant cultures until quite recently. And smacking bans are not universal yet. It's not banned in Canada, I think. It's not, I looked it up, it's not banned in England. It's banned in Scotland, where I am. So something that was once seen as good, it was a duty that you had to do, is now increasingly seen as criminal. That's how the shift goes. And you can see how it's tied to the two ethics I'm talking about. So my question is, and what the COVID crisis really asks us is, where does care fit in? Is care one of the Christian values that we used to be able to fit in our value system, but no longer? And is that why it's marginalized, or is it more complicated? Of course, the old medical system and the caring system was absolutely tied up with the churches. I love this picture, it's actually from Denmark. But the nurses as the nuns, and the sort of the whole ethos of what it was about, important in all our health systems as a background, and care as an asymmetrical relationship of looking after the other. So is it tied with that ethic, or can it change? We've just seen an absolute rise in nurse applications, interestingly, because of COVID. Can the live your life ethic endorse care? I think it probably can. And I'm going to have my last royal family picture here, because I think that Diana was actually, that was part of her revolution, was moving from a more sort of distant charity to a more, emotional, affective model of caring. But you might think that's bonkers to say that, because she's hardly equal. She's a princess still doing that old traditional royal work. But where does care fit in our value system today is my question. And I think that the COVID crisis really exposed that question. Can we put it on a better footing? Finally, and briefly, I just want to talk about values, organizational or corporate values, because it just strikes me how much the pandemic has exposed what an organization's values really are. Whether that's a university or another sort of workplace or a school or whatever it might be, what it had a value statement. Were they really operative when the crisis came and when really hard decisions had to be made, decisions that could easily cost people lives? What values were in play at that point? The underlying reality comes to the surface, and I think for the institutions that each one of us knows best, we can probably see much more clearly what the values really were in practice. Now, long before the crisis, what I'm talking about, the old service ethic had declined already, and the idea of lifetime service to your workplace in return for care and security and a pension, that has been dropping out very, very quickly. And now we have more of is it a contractual bargaining we have with our life? We give a bit of our life and our time, and what are they going to give us in return? And it's well known that organizations are struggling to accommodate the values of younger people now. Another of your great thinkers, John Ralston Saul, I think says rightly that corporations are the most important parts, the most important sociologically, as well as democracy. These are the two important things in our lives today in late modernity. And this is his definition of a corporation. Corporations exist to serve their own interests. I mean, that can be good or bad. He thinks it's very often bad. How does it go wrong? Well, in his view, it goes wrong, not only his view, many people's views. Corporations go bad when they don't, an educational establishment stops being about educating younger people. it becomes about keeping itself going and being very prominent and getting lots of cash in to keep itself at the top of the competitive table, say. And institutions forget what they're for, what their purpose is. And they can easily be captured by leaders, is the ubiquitous term. I put that in for one of our panelists who's an expert about leadership, who can run them chiefly for their own benefit and draw very large salaries from them. And we have horrible examples that many of us live with of HR, PR, communications department and lawyers all being harnessed to defend the institution, to make people sign non-disclosure agreements, to suppress an open learning environment that can admit to faults. Some of you might remember from the counterculture, Ivan Illich, who wrote brilliantly about this, and he talked about the iatrogenic effect, which is where the cure becomes the disease. So he said schools start to make people stupid because they make people feel that they can't learn in their own right. So they sort of infantilize people. And modern medicine makes people sick. And religion makes people act really badly. So they become completely counterproductive. Well, was this true of the institutions we know about in the pandemic? Did it show that really they were just being run for their own interests or the interests of a particular cadre within them? Or were they really running for the benefit of society more widely, or whatever aspect of it they want to serve? Were they prepared to take an economic hit to save lives? Did they abide by their stated values? Did they put people's lives at risk rather than risk their profits? And who was it really run for? I think that's a fascinating question that the pandemic really helps us to answer for many institutions. It's been very eye-opening. I suppose you could ask of state institutions as well and governments. So I'm out of time and I'm going to conclude now. I've talked about the rise of values and their visibility. I've argued it's much a bottom up as a top down, and that those things go together to make it such a powerful phenomenon at the moment. I've talked about the shift from Christian to post-Christian culture and a sacrificial to a life ethic as being an important aspect of this. I've mentioned that I don't think this is just a progress, that actually we just get values piled up and often conflicting. And that's why we should expect to see conflicts and with values made very visible in them. And I'm arguing overall that values have taken over lots of the good and bad things that religion and the churches used to do. In some ways, I am actually quite a fan of values. I quite like the way that they force you to think about how the institutions run, how you behave. They force you to be accountable and to think about what you really stand for. And I quite like the way that they're rather more modest than, fights over doctrine and dogma can be really terrible. In some ways, it's easier to have an argument about values because you can usually find some common values. But it's a two-edged sword because values can become a sort of fundamentalism of a very unpleasant and moralistic kind. And that's me done. And I'm looking forward to discussion and hearing your views. Thank you very much for listening.
Thanks very much, Linda. That was wonderful, as expected. I'm so glad we chose you to go last because in many ways, I'm not sure if you've been able to attend the other talks, but in many ways, some of the broader framing theories you're using to draw these issues into the surface are really pulling the talks together in a really wonderful way. So thanks very much for that. So we're going to begin with a question and some engagement by Geraldine Marcier from the University of Montreal. Oh, you're muted still, I think. You need to turn your volume up, I think. I can hear you a little bit.
Can you hear me now?
That's better.
That's better.
Yeah. That's better.
No, I'm sorry, my headset didn't work. So thank you, Paul, first for inviting me to comment Linda's presentation, and thank you, Linda, for raising so many questions. Actually, there are so many things we could say about your talk. It's really, really rich, and thank you for sharing all these ideas. First, I would like to say I'm not as pessimistic as you regarding care as a value, because I think the pandemic showed that care plays much more into a relational frame that goes beyond health institutions as care providers, but also on one-on-one basis or family or even neighborhood basis. But maybe I'm too idealistic, I don't know. But anyway, my ethnographic studies confirm many of your ideas. And I could say that in Quebec and even in Canada, we observed the same shift from religion to morality and then to ethics and values. So first, maybe in Canada, this focus on values does not so much occurs among people who say they are non-religious, but also among people who say they have a religion. But especially, I would say, among people who choose to have a religion, and among the people who convert to different religions, especially to Islam, because that's the people I studied. The converts to Islam I observed and I studied told me, I chose Islam because Islam carries some values that are important to me. So, so in this setting, a conversion to Islam that I witnessed, especially among youth, makes Islam and Islamic values as a transgression as a value. And in this setting, we could also say that values also allows a form of moral distinction. That's a point you raised, and I fully agree. In Quebec, we witnessed this shift from in school from traditional catechism, who has gradually been replaced by a class of morality for the kids, and now we have a class of ethic and religious culture. So this totally abide by what you say. But what is also interesting is that in response to the religious minorities' claims in Quebec, we have this response of the government in 2013 that decided to offer the Charter of Québécois Values, just to say the religious minorities have their values, but we also have our values. And actually in Quebec, everybody was wondering, what are Québécois values? And actually the values that were conveyed was gender equity, Francophonie, and this raises the question, do values raises a new nationalism? Is this a new nationalism? Is this a risk, you know? On the other hand, you seemed to consider that this focus on value is rooted in individualism. So what is the role of this focus on values regarding collectivities, regarding groups, and even nation states? There's another word that you didn't mention in your talk, and I expected actually this word because I know you worked on spirituality, and you didn't mention the issue of spirituality in your talk. And actually in Quebec, I would say that spirituality has become a new political discourse that is socially acceptable, politically correct. And what they mean by spirituality is maybe this set of values that you mentioned. So maybe I would like to hear you, if we have some time, about your understanding of spirituality and how spirituality articulates with this focus on values. For example, in cooperation, you said values are taken into account. And actually, I would say that values are taken into account by offering spiritual practices like mindfulness practices. Into account the values of people, you offer spiritual practices. So how does this articulate in your talk?
Thanks, Geraldine.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm just mindful of the time. We have about half an hour, and those are wonderful observations and questions. I wonder if we could give Linda a chance to reflect on them a little bit. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I need an hour. That's fantastic, Geraldine. Thank you. And the Québécois values, that's fantastic. I love hearing about that. Let me just You raise one really important point about national values, not just personal values. I think that the live your life ethic, which has become so pervasive, where we think it's right for all of us to live our life, is non-partisan. I think it's shared as much by the right as the left. So I've done a lot of value surveying, but it seems that there are two different clusters of values. One are your personal values, where there's a lot of agreement about some basic values like self-determination and choice. And as you know, Muslims wearing the veil say it's because it's my personal choice. They appeal to exactly the same value as the liberal value. So on personal ethics, there's a lot of commonality. But on political ethics, as we know, there's a huge diversity from left to right. So one, we have a lot in common, but then the political, social, what you think is socially good is different. And in the USA, I mean, that's much more Britain and I think Canada, where you get those two different scales. In the USA, the culture wars try and put them together. So you've got to have this, on the right, you have different personal values as well. But I don't think people do really. I think we all share a live your life ethic. So anyway, people who think of the nation as a high value tend to be on the right wing politically, but they might share the same basic personal value. You had another question that was really interesting and important, and I haven't got time to answer, but that's about how the rise of spirituality is tied up with this shift of values. And it's a wonderfully perceptive question. I think it's very tied up because I think spirituality provided a sort of transition, it enabled a transition for generations who were brought up Christian when they were children, but didn't like the moralism, didn't like being told what to do, but didn't want to give up on religion completely. And it enabled them to keep some of the spiritual aspects and put it in a different values frame, and very much more a live your life ethical frame. So I think part of the reason for the rise of spirituality was about wanting to move to the different values, but keeping a spiritual core to it. But what's happening now that spirituality is so mainstream is another question, again, which I won't address now, but it's fascinating.
Thanks.
And
We'll
it's becoming much more right and left wing now as it gets much more mainstream.
Yeah. Be lovely to have the two of you back in conversation, perhaps in a John Albert Hall context. But since you brought up spirituality, Geraldine, and since Linda, you kind of reflected on it nicely, I have a feeling this is a good opportunity now to bring in Nathan Larud from Portland, Oregon.
Thank you, Paul. It's lovely to get to be with you virtually here. I've enjoyed my time in Canadian dialogues and kind of thinking about my context in Portland in the United States as part of this larger region of Cascadia, right? So in some ways, Portland has a lot more in common with Vancouver and Victoria than we do with Boston, Houston, Dallas, Richmond, Virginia, name your city. So it's interesting to kind of think with you all around kind of what the religious context looks like on the western coast of North America. And Professor Woodhead, I particularly appreciate your explication of the U.S. culture war. I'm a child of the culture war, a refugee, you might say, from the culture war, growing up as a queer kid in a conservative Protestant religious context, found the Episcopal Church, the Anglican tradition, largely because I knew I was gay. I knew I needed a place to, as we've kind of just been talking about, right, to maintain the values that I was taught, but lose some of the dogma, the moralistic kind of shaming values. So that kind of realignment has been a piece of my personal story, but it's also a piece of the story I think in our region. People realigning around different understanding of spirituality. One of my colleagues who is just up the street from me is the rabbi of the largest Jewish congregation in Oregon. And he and I sometimes say, actually sociologically, our congregations are a lot more similar, a Jewish synagogue and an Anglican cathedral, than the similarity I might have as a Christian pastor with any other Christian congregation in town. And largely that's because of our shared sort of sense of value. Some of that's because we share the Hebrew tradition and there's a common Christian Jewish ethic there of love of neighbor and tikkun olam and some of that scriptural tradition. But I think it's more about what you're talking about, these sort of sociological realignments around shared values that I think is largely reorganizing the religious landscape in our region, which is a really interesting thing to think about. And actually what I want to ask you about, your last point is that it's easier to have an argument around values than it is around religious dogma, right? So that helps explain how interreligious dialogue is shifting in some ways. But that phrase culture war is so interesting to me, right? I mean, in some ways, like we're sort of coming into a new realm of it. I would have called that a metaphoric idea until January 6th in the US, when we actually saw our Capitol building being stormed by armed militants. And suddenly the phrase culture war has a much higher stakes for me. And I'm interested in the potential of values, both as a way of cutting through some of that, right? Are people less likely to enact violence on other people if we're talking in the framework of values? Or, as you say, is this potentially creating a new kind of fundamentalism that might actually lead to a new kind of values-based violence? And how as religious leaders ought we to respond to that?
Big questions, wonderful questions. Thank you. Well, Davison wrote his second book was called Before the Shooting Begins. And he was talking about, would it be a real war? Because it was just a metaphor war. He took it from Kulturkampf, from German history. And part of his point is that actually it's not a shooting war. And until the Capitol, it wasn't a shooting war. So partly that led him to think it's good to have this values war. It doesn't actually, it may be very fierce, but it doesn't lead to actual bloodshed, unlike other civil wars. Maybe we're going to revise our opinion about that, but you're right, that puts that whole issue very sharply, doesn't it? I said an optimistic thing about being able to get beyond values disagreements, and I was thinking about some people who are really expert in mediation work and coaching who've taught me about this, and there are schools that work at generative conversations where when somebody clearly displays sets of values that clash with yours, your reaction isn't immediately to say that's wrong and you're immoral, but to get to a point where you find a shared value. And at some point there will be. So you say, well, you seem to care very much about the family. And then what's behind that? And you keep going on until you can almost always find that actually you've got some shared value. Very few people are completely amoral. And in a shared value, values really bind us together. So that's what you found some shared ground, you can move on from that. Now, if your disagreement is about the nature of the atonement, it's often much harder. You can't really mediate between one view and the other view. There is no shared ground, which is why you get absolutely terrible theological wars and schisms. And so I'm thinking optimistically that perhaps there is more scope in values.
Thank you. Thanks. So Marilyn Taylor, who is one of the only card-carrying experts on values on this panel.
I know, I'm looking forward to Marilyn.
That's right, being responsible for that kind of a program at Royal Roads University on the island. So please take it away, Marilyn. Oh, you're still muted.
There we go.
There we go.
Too many windows up here. Well, this is first of all, I must say, I don't think there is an expert on values. The expert on values is the person who walks the talk, I would say. And that is the huge, so I was going to speak about that gap. I wanted also to pick up on the conversation about that's at a national or corporate or governmental level as well as a personal level. I want to say that the huge possibility for leaders to make a difference here is really palpable. The pandemic, I think you could see as a PET scan on leadership. And we have some outstanding examples nationally, as well as corporately, as well as provincially on that. And we have some disasters, absolute disasters. So in a sense, we have a tremendous opportunity to learn about leadership. It is, in my view, leaders of entities, whether again, provinces, countries, corporations, teams, that are the influential people, and their values and how they manage their values will make the huge difference. The issue here, going back to your work, Professor Woodhead, in the beginning, is that where people are now self-defining in so many different ways, is one has to now earn trust in order to lead, not simply have power over. And so that's a significant shift. And my view over time is that however capable at communication we are, leadership, whatever, in a variety of organization strategies, it is leaders' values that are the critical bedrock of leading through what is more and more on a wide scale and a local scale uncertainty because of the world and the way it's happening. So values are the ground, the foundation, potentially. However, as you've pointed out, Professor Woodhead and Dean Rudd, these values can also have a polarizing effect, or they can have a building, a generative connecting effect. And going back to your last point, Professor Woodhead, which was just perfect, leaders have the opportunity to explore common ground, to build consensus, to build engagement, to build wide participation with a purpose, or they have the opportunity to send everybody off in the corners. And that we've seen that in the news every night all over the place. Or we've also seen how people have rallied together in the face of danger, real danger, to actually overcome, through uncertainty. And it's generally people who are authentic and who walk their talk that have the authority. That is the place where authority comes, I believe now, in our world. If there is authority, that's where it can come from. And it's been demonstrated. We have our local heroine, Bonnie Henry, Royal Roads, where I work, conferred on her an honorary doctorate for a very good reason, that she really acted decisively, compassionately, authentically, consistently. Nobody doubted her purpose, which was to optimize our health in this province. And that took us, to the bottom of the climbs on infection and death rates, contrasted with some other premiers who have actually got big problems on their hands. And so I want to thank you for that, Professor Woodhead. You highlighted that beautifully. And your comment, Dean Rudd, around the whole question of the possibility of churches and synagogues and mosques, other faith institutions, and brought about through things like the Center for Study of Religion and Society, finding common values in order to exert. And that also is for secular humanism. If we have a language of common values, that is possibly the ground for a way in which we can face our huge problems, which were discussed, I'm sure, eloquently by Homer Dixon 2 days ago.
Thank you so much. Thanks very much, Marilyn. So Linda? I've got a couple good questions.
Wonderful. I just learned a lot from that. Thank you. And I'm always going to remember that it's a PET scan for leadership. I totally agree with you. And I think it also revealed not just the quality of leaders, but who was the real leader? Because a lot of people actually ended up leading who aren't designated the leader. But in the absence of leadership, it's amazing how it revealed who was capable of stepping up and doing that task. It'll all revert back to normal, unfortunately, I'm afraid, once it's over, but we've noticed some things. And I like your example at the end and how it was two things really struck me about good leaders. One, some people were able to see what a serious crisis this was. A lot of people weren't. They pretended nothing, it would all be fine tomorrow and it was all going to be over really quickly, and they just weren't able to sit with how bad it was. That was some value that was lacking. But you said compassion. I think that was another thing. And just some appreciation of human values. That really came out. Some people actually said that in my university. You're not thinking about the human values here. And some people were able to really make that mean something at the beginning of the crisis. So thank you very much, Professor Taylor, for your comments.
My pleasure.
Thanks, Linda. So Geraldine asked a question about the rise of spirituality as one of the kind of key metaphors and values which gets circulated in this kind of post-institutional time period. And Caitlin Wakefield asked a very good question, which I think will give you an opportunity perhaps to reflect on some of this. And Caitlin asks, one of the concepts that has become popular recently is self-care. And she wants to know, is this something that you see butting up against old values and morals, such as the stiff upper lip or soldiering on? This, in some sense, I think ties in nicely to some of Geraldine's reflections.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And it is a really new thing, isn't it? And I think it's absolutely part of the live your life ethic and the move away from thinking that you only care for other people. And now we see the value of caring for yourself. And it's just a fantastic example, thank you for raising it, of exactly what I wanted to talk about. It's really quite a profound ethical shift.
Well, and then that raises another question, which actually was posed by Brendan Nielsen. Where is he? Here he is. Because actually that ethic, which is articulated so well within a kind of an economic vernacular. So Brendan asks, I'm curious about the metaphoric connection between the economic world into the religious one in values language. What values are hidden in the mapping from economics to ethics? Because the self-care thing, so, you know, those of us who have Fitbits or any kinds of exercise monitors that we often wear with us, they'll have little reminders to take time for yourself or to move around or to engage in self-care. And as Geraldine pointed out, similarly at workplaces, they have these opportunities, in fact, in some sense, regimes of taking care of the self such that you can maintain your productive role in the machine, as it were, of whatever corporation or university, whatever you're working for. So this interesting question about the values language being an economic vernacular.
Yes, I see the connection there. I always think that, you know, being reminded to do self-care seems like the opposite of what self-care should be about, which is self-awareness about when you need to take a break or whatever. Somebody told me they had a wearable for mindfulness, and that seems like a complete contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But self-care is also, I mean, of course, it's monetized and promoted in that way, but it's also, I think it comes out of lots of groups facing real particular challenges of mental health, who often have been able to find each other through the internet and help one another. It's not a purely individualistic thing. There's a very interesting social basis now to self-care, and I think the courage and the honesty to own up to when you need self-care and what your vulnerabilities and problems are is certainly a value, I think.
Hannah McKillop, she asks a question that I think you can answer out of your familiarity with Christian ethics and Christian history. She asks, individualism is a central tenet of Protestant ethics. If individualism is also central to non-religious worldview or ethical systems, as Crystal Manning argues, how is this non-religious individualist worldview different from the individualism found much earlier in the Protestant ethic?
Oh, that's a difficult question. There are, I think, and there must be, you know, a genealogy there and a linkage to them. But I mean, individualism is a very slippery word because it can mean lots of things. But individualism as having to make your own authentic choice is certainly part of Christian tradition. It's a Charles Taylor point as well, actually. Christianity's always been about having to you had to make your choice for Christ. So it's always been there. And that's part of where it comes from. I think that's entirely correct. But it's It's the giving of your life for another person. What was the little slogan that people used to say when I started interviewing people in churches when I was much younger? Older ladies would say, self, what was it? I can't remember. It's like self first, you know, it was an ordering of self last, you know, and and the middle letter in sin is I. So anything about self-care being inherently bad, that's what we've shifted away from, not the focus on the importance of your own choice and autonomy.
And just to bring it home for the last 10 minutes, perhaps, John Tatamanol from New York, but who's currently with us now, he writes, if I can choose my values and you yours, then do these values become fundamentally arbitrary? In other words, is there anything I am obliged to value? For example, the value of water, soil, trees, air, for example. What if our calling is to attend to and be responsive to the values really resident in things? I suppose this is a question about the source of values, the valuer, and the world replete values to which we must be responsive.
Yes, that's a very fundamental question. And I mean, a monotheist would say you can have that absoluteness because they're valuable to God. And that's what Augustine argues in his Ethics, that it's because God values these things that they are valuable. And the good life is to value the things that God, to find out what they are, to understand that, and then to value them in that way. So you might be making your own choice, but you're recognizing because they're valuable to God that it takes out the relativism of them. I think there's a middle ground that most people hold today, which isn't absolute relativism and subjectivism. Oh, it's just good because I chose it. It's a sort of, it's almost as if sociology's got into the mainstream. So we realize that it's not just an arbitrary choice that I'm not going to kill you. This is the basis for our society. It's a shared value. It makes life necessary. It's not something you can pick up or drop. And so it's not a choice between complete empty choice relativism and unchanging absolutes. However, I still think there's a really hard question that has been raised here, and that's are there nevertheless principles that are somehow deeper than values? You know, something like truthfulness, or like you say, care for the planet, or are these things that we ought to have some sort of fundamental principles, and there are some, despite all the fact that we individually, yes, we get our own package of values and that's fine, but are there underlying principles? I seesaw about this. I don't know the answer.
Well, so let's go to the last question from a very dear friend of ours, Patricia Lane. And this is a question which perhaps can be engaged by Linda or other people on the panel. Patricia asks, Mark Carney, the former governor of both the Bank of Canada and the UK Central Bank, and now the UN Special Envoy on Climate and Finance, is calling for recentering economics on values and away from value. How can we advocate compellingly for this in a world with culture wars so active?
I don't know, what was Mark Carney talking about? Does anyone know what he meant when he said recenter economics from value to values? Did he have what was in his mind? What provoked him to say this?
That I don't know. I don't know if Patricia can quickly write to me in the Q&A or chat. Does anybody else?
Anyone who knows about economics, what it means in that world, how it cashes out.
My understanding is it has to do with climate change. Mark's concern around climate change is bringing us to realize that just value isn't enough.
And value,
right, Patricia writes financial value as the dominant value, so there's a critique of that.
Yes.
If you did a search in databases with the word value, it would come up corporate value, meaning money.
Right.
I would imagine, given his profession, that he knows that he's using value in that sense, and that values is what we're talking about and also what he wants to be talking about.
Yes, I understand. So, and then that cashes out in reforms in the whole banking system, doesn't it? And thinking beyond just making a profit as to what's the bigger context in which you do that. I mean, it's obviously a problem that's a problem in particular parts of the financial industries. perhaps less a problem. I was going to say less a problem for ordinary people who think it seems obvious that money isn't the only value, but perhaps I'm being optimistic and that's not the case.
Yep.
I do discern, particularly amongst younger generations and my students, a real insight about that and not wanting to live life. This is the values visibility, not wanting to live life just to make money, but for what? If you haven't got a value towards which to do that,
I think we were reminded of that early on in the pandemic, where I'm not sure if it was a senator or a congressperson who said, he would be willing to sacrifice his own life if it meant that his grandchildren could continue to have the American dream, right? That there was this, in the absence of any kind of higher values discourse, the value of keeping the economy going and getting people back to work, which we see in Texas and other places in the United States today, rolling back the mask mandates and so forth, because the urge, the drive to return the economy to its steady state of doing what the economy does is so strong that the other kinds of values, Jennifer Henry pointed out in the chat that her perception is that he's talking about the triple bottom line of financial, social, and ecological. Right. So if the financial bottom line predominates, then it sort of blocks out, it overshadows all other ways of thinking about what values might mean.
Right. And, that kind of invisible hand idea that if you just act for your profit, it's all going to work out somehow in some invisible mechanism. That view is widely criticized now as well.
Right, it'll trickle down and everyone will be properly cared for and vaccinated, and all the social inequities.
Actually very good on values. He knew that wasn't the case. You had to have values as well for the economy to work. Right,
and yet we've taken him up rather selectively and bracketed those other aspects of those perspectives. So any final reflections from the panel before I bring us to a close? No?
I did like
thanks.
Daniel Boyarin wrote here the famous old statement of the English child of about a century ago. I know that I'm here to help all other people in the world, but what are they here for? That's the weakness of the sacrifice. I think that's great.
Indeed. Yeah. Thanks very much. So I want to first thank Linda for joining us today and offering us such rich conversation to, I think, really round out our series very well. I want to thank Geraldine, Nathan, and Marilyn for asking such good questions that I think will seed the conversation that we have on March 16th when all the panelists return. Thanks very much to Anna Greenwood-Lee for bringing the greetings of the diocese, to Ian Alexander, who's really my partner in crime at the diocese in terms of organizing this series, and Scott Dolph and Rachel Brown for helping make sure everything happens on time. And just to give you some sense of what's coming up next at the center, please take a look at the next few slides. That'll give you some sense of what we have in store for you. So the next speaker, we have a weekly lecture series featuring the research of our faculty fellows and grad student fellows. Next week, Kathy Chan, who's from the Faculty of Law, is going to be sharing with us a lecture on adjudication of religious refugee claims. And then that's March 11th at 5 o'clock, which is our normal slot. And then next Tuesday at 11 o'clock, in other words, at this time slot, we're going to have all of the panelists, Noam Chomsky, Miroslav Volf, Essie Adujian, Thomas Homer Dixon, and Linda Woodhead back for a conversation that I'll sort of playfully and lightly moderate that picks up on some of the themes that have emerged in all of their lectures and in the conversations around their lectures. So join us for that next week, Tuesday, March 16th at 11 o'clock. You will need to pre-register. So please make sure you do that. And Rachel Brown has put in the chat box to all the people, all the participants, some information about the center, our activities, and those links that you'll need. So thanks very much, everybody. Have a good rest of the week and weekend, and we'll see you hopefully next week.